In this video, we'll be taking a look at a more advanced example of modeling with openEHR. This is going to be a complete example from start to finish, and we are actually going to be taking a look at one particular paper form from a real life hospital. So this is actually the form. So again, I have redacted the name of the hospital, and this is a gynecology case record. Now, if you look closely, it has a lot of fields, and we are actually going to be modeling this using the archetype designer. Now, I already have my archetype designer up and running, so let me go inside. So, taking a look at the form, the first thing that you see is that it has a lot of patient details like the patient name, age, sex, department, unit, ward. So in openEHR, we don't handle all of these things within the EHR. So we usually capture the patient information separately in either the administration system or the demographics system. And openEHR is purely meant for clinical information. And sometimes things like age and gender may be related to the clinical information at hand, but it is always best practice to capture that separately because that is unlikely to change. And you want to keep that separate from the actual clinical data points that you're capturing. So again, coming back here, so we see that the patient's name, age, sex, all these things we will not be capturing in our template. And finally, here we have the final diagnosis. This is something that we need to capture. Complaint and duration. So meaning, again, for people who have no clinical background and all, I'll also try to explain what these things mean. So complaint and duration is the patient comes with a certain complaint and you want to know for how long the complaint has been persisting for, either in days, months, or years. Family history. You want to know what kind of diseases the family has. Either some relation might have some disease. Past history. So things that the patient has had in the past, you want to also ask information about this. And here, since it's a gynecology case record, things like single, married, widow, and the number of years for which the person has been married and the number of years for which they have been widowed is also asked. And again, this is not something that belongs in openEHR, and there might be archetypes for it, but I would personally want to record this in a demographics service, maybe using something like FHIR, using a FHIR patient resource. Now again, we have previous menstrual history, we have the menarche, and how the cycle is, and LMP, and these are all proper clinical data points. And finally, we have the present condition. Now the present condition, it may be something to do with the current condition, or it may have something to do with these complaints. So what they mean by present condition in this case is the history of the presenting illness, HPI as they call it in the US. And I know this because I know the hospital and I've clarified this with them. But usually if you are given a form and you don't know what it means, it's best to always ask the nurse or the doctor what this actually means before modeling it. Now, they have a MR number here that doesn't really matter. And then we come to the examination, and they have a general examination, they have an abdomen examination, they have a pelvic examination, and then they have just urine routine. I think this is to record the urine, probably a dipstick test, and then the BP, the blood pressure. And here they have the provisional diagnosis and recommendations. So we'll not be going into recommendations in this case, but we will record the provisional diagnosis for sure. And they again have further notes on admission. So this is, again, this form has been designed in such a way that they will also use the same piece of paper to record details after admission. So admission being a separate entity in itself, they still use the same form to record that. Now, while you are designing templates, you don't need to stick with what exactly is present on the paper. You have to think about the workflow which the people are used to and which you don't want to disrupt their workflow. But at the same time, you don't want to stick with wrong traditions and things that are kind of incorrect. So you do have some flexibility when you are converting something from paper into digital. So use that to actually reassess how workflows can be made better. Now let's actually start implementing this. So I already have my archetype designer open. So I'm going to create a new template, and let's, this is a very classic example of an encounter. So let's use the encounter archetype. So template ID. Okay. So I would like to put the hospital's name first. So hospital A dot, and it's called, it's a gynac case record. So let's just call it that. .v0 because we are just starting. So hospital A dot gynac case record v0. Let's create that, and we are in. Now, firstly, looking at this gynac case record, let's first capture the final diagnosis. Although this is probably the thing that somebody writes last, they've put it on the top because they want to see what the diagnosis of the patient is immediately when looking at the case record. Now, when we again convert something to a digital copy, we can have different views when it comes to writing and when it comes to reading. So although this is an artifact of paper being used as both the write medium and the read medium, we can actually change this. We don't need to have the final diagnosis as the first data element. So I'll not be putting it that first. I'll come to this in the end. So complaint and duration. So now there is an archetype in openEHR. So again, if you search in the CKM, you'll know it, but I already know this. So I'm just going to use this. So it's called the symptom and sign, and it's right here. You can see this right here, symptom/sign. So if you see what this actually means in the detail, reported observation of a physical or mental disturbance in an individual. So that is what we actually want to record. So when they come with a complaint, it's either a physical or mental disturbance, and it's not worded correctly when they say physical or mental disturbance, but sign is something that a physician elicits, and symptom is something the patient complains about. And we have the same archetype for both, and it does make sense because they are very similar in concept. They are just, in the semantics of the medical world, they would like to have it as two different things, but for all practical purposes, signs and symptoms are the same. Now, we see under signs and symptoms, we have all of these different attributes. Now, we are going to be restructuring this a little bit. So I will first do a one iteration of the whole thing, then I will start restructuring it again. So now again, signs and symptoms, any event is 0 to multiple. We'll leave that as it is because they do want to capture multiple complaints and duration. Now complaint and duration is all they want. So we'll actually name this complaint and duration. Now under signs and symptom, we will just make it symptom. And again, if we look at the details of it, the name of the reported sign or symptom. Symptom name should be coded with the terminology where possible. Again, we can, whenever we leave it as free text, as I said in the previous lesson, it also means that they can capture it as a coded text. But if you want it to be explicit, you can actually change this to external coded and set the actual, you can add a custom terminology. For example, I'm going to name it SNOMED CT, SNOMED CT, and save that. So this will make sure that it loads up SNOMED CT in the UI if we are using UI tools like that. So we will use SNOMED CT to capture the symptom. And nil significant, again, this means that this is a negation property, meaning that that symptom is not present. It's not an issue. That's not what we want to represent. I'm canceling that. In fact, I'll just cancel everything except the things that are mandatory, which is again the symptom itself. And we need the duration also. So let's have the duration. So now we have the symptom and the duration. So complaint and duration. In fact, we will not call this symptom. We'll just call it complaint because it will be consistent with this naming. Now, again, they also have things like we can also reassess our workflow by looking at other points in the archetype. Episodicity, new occurrence, first occurrence, recurrence, episode onset, like when did this begin? So sometimes this is important. Duration tells you how long it has lasted, but episode onset tells you when it began. So it might be a condition that began 4 years ago but just lasted for 2 weeks and then it got over. So duration alone does not capture the full meaning of the complaint, but in this case they just want complaint and duration. Now it's also very tempting when you directly go to doctors and give them an archetype designer, or you sit with them and ask them what all they want. They have the tendency to say that they want more data points than they need. You need to control this because it becomes really hard to enter data in the field when you're actually doing it. So always stick to the minimal data points that you need and keep most of the things optional so that people can skip past details. So especially in a quick clinical setting, you do want to keep most of these things optional. So complaint and duration, I think that should be enough. We've just captured the complaint and the duration. So we'll just cancel out modifying and relieving factors because we are not really using them. So now this is actually a type called cluster. We'll look at this more in detail in another, when using another archetype. I'll come to that. But yeah, I think that should be enough. So complaint here is a coded text and duration is duration, meaning you can have like any months, weeks, and you can just allow all of these. So in fact, you can set a default value. I'm not going to do that. So here, one more thing I want to tell is the complaint, when we change it into a coded text, it cannot take a text. So all text fields can take a coded text, but coded text is a specialization of a text. So you cannot enter free text if you explicitly choose that a coded text needs to be present. So that's also something to keep in mind. So it's always better to keep it as a text and record a coded text during runtime, because sometimes you want to have the option to default to text. For example, when you don't find the term in SNOMED-CT, you want to have the ability to let the doctor enter the text that they want to enter. So for now, we'll just be going with SNOMED-CT. We are going to be a strict hospital which only takes complaints in SNOMED-CT. But for practical purposes, you are better off leaving this as a text field. So that's about it for complaint and duration. Family history. So let's search family history. We've got a family history archetype and it's V2. So that's good. Means it's, so let's look at family history. And again, they have a summary of the family history and they have two different clusters again. So a cluster is a data type which can contain other data types. So it's something that you can repeat multiple times and you can put other data types inside it. So in this case, and you can also take a cluster archetype and then put it inside a slot. So we'll see that again, but if you need to know, we'll actually use this here. So there are two ways of capturing this data point. So one is per problem and one is per family member. So what this means is that you can either say this problem has been present with these family members. So for example, let's take leukemia, and we can say that leukemia has been present in the family and all of these people have this particular problem, like her mother, the father, the brother. So that makes sense when you take a look at genetic diseases, or so let's again come to this. So again, in the comment they've mentioned, if the problem has a genetic predisposition within families, then only genetic relatives should be considered as part of this data. So this is made for genetic diseases where you want to record a problem and then list out all of the family members who have that particular problem. Now, there is also per family member. And this is the more usual kind, where you tell that the mother has diabetes, the father has something else. That's the usual history that we record when we are recording the family history, unless it's a genetic condition where you actually want to map out the pedigree chart and you want to put the circles on the squares and you want to shade them out. But in this case, we'll just be going per family member and we'll cancel this out. So again, here we have a lot of details of the family member. For example, the family member name, the alias. So again, you can give an alternative name of the family member right here in the EHR. And you also have another slot to actually take in the family member details. So most of the time, if you are doing something like this, you will capture the family member also in another server. But again, that's going into too much detail. For now, we'll just assume that we want to capture the relationship type, which will be like mother, father, brother. SNOMED City has a good list for that, and the disease that they have. Now, family member name is what that would be. Alias, I'm going to cancel. I'm going to cancel everything that's optional first. So again, summary, we don't really need a summary. So per family member, I want the family member name. I don't want the biological sex. Okay, wait, this is the family member's name of the family member. Actually, we don't care about the name of the family member actually. We just care about the relationship. And ideally, we want this to be in SNOMED City, so we can change that later. Relationship degree of the family. Okay, so the first degree, second degree, cousin, so things like that. Date of birth, deceased, age of death. So now here is where, okay, server connection, okay, ignore. Now, here is where we actually need to record what problem they have, correct? So per family member has the family member details, and we also need to have the history, the clinical history, that details about the problem diagnosis of the family member. Okay, we will click on plus on this. So again, this is a cluster, and we have a clinical history cluster within that cluster. Now here is where we actually have the problem diagnosis name, and we have the clinical description, we have the age at onset. Now that's where we'll usually record the problem. So let's just call it problem. Clinical description, cause of death. We don't really need a comment. Biomarkers, they have some biomarker, but we don't need that for the time being. So we'll just record this as per family member, and which will, again, we need to check the cardinality of this. So 0 to multiple, so which means we can record multiple family members together. We have the relationship and we have the problem. So I think that should do it for this. So complaint and duration finished, family history done. Let's look at past history. So now when it comes to past history, there have been questions that have been asked on the discourse. So I want you to also understand that people do ask a lot of questions, and discourse may be a good place to start. Past history, recording past history. So somebody has asked this, and people have replied, and again, it's Dr. S.B. Bhattacharya again. So he's asked this, and people have told that, have you tried looking at problem diagnosis qualifier, which plugs into the problem diagnosis archetype? So okay, we'll take a look at that. So again, there is the problem diagnosis archetype, which usually takes a diagnosis. So problem diagnosis. So we'll be using this for something like provisional diagnosis or the final diagnosis. So this is past history. So again, we are taking the problem diagnosis archetype, but we are calling it past history. The reason is because you want these to show up even when you ask what all problems the patient has. So just because the patient says he has diabetes and the current problem is, let's say, sickle cell anemia, you don't want to miss out on diabetes just because you only record one problem. So that's the beauty in recording, using the same archetypes for things that want to be grouped together. So we are recording past history, but it also shows up under the problem diagnosis archetype. So again, we'll be looking at more detail of how you can query these in the AQL module. But for now, as Silji is telling, you can look at the, have you looked at the problem diagnosis qualifier? So again, I want to see what that is. So problem diagnosis name, we'll keep that as it is, and I'm just going to cancel out all the optional elements. And here, if you see, there is a slot called status. So this is a slot. So a slot takes in another archetype. So you can do these as well. So you have an archetype that takes in another archetype. So we've already done this with compositions. A composition takes in other archetypes, but even within archetypes, you can have other archetypes within those. So the status, it tells you by default that it is meant for this particular archetype. So this is the preferred one, but you can use other archetypes as well. So the one that's shown in green is the preferred archetype. So again, problem/diagnosis qualifier. So let's put that in, and it tells you the diagnosis status, the current or past. That exactly represents whether this is past or current history. So we will set the default value to past, and we will only allow past, and everything else we are going to be snowflaking out. So we'll keep current or past active, and everything else I think we'll just So again, there is a diagnosis status, preliminary, working, established, refuted. So now if we understand correctly, if you come here, it seems like they have a separate section for the provisional diagnosis, and they then come and write the final diagnosis here. But looking at the workflow here, it's kind of, it makes sense to have one diagnosis archetype and then change the status of it when we finally promote it to the final diagnosis. So we will be looking at that also. So we'll be looking at how we can do that. Now, current or past, that's fine. The problem or the diagnosis name. So what else do we need? So I think past history, that should be it. Like the problem that they have and the problem status, which by default we'll set to the past history because it's inside the past history section. So anything else? Maybe the date of onset to tell how long it has been there. But again, I don't want to add more data types than they already record. So let's leave it at that. So past history, that's done. So now single, married, widow, all these I take it as administrative data. But marital status, let's search once in the CKM if there is any archetype that can be used for that. So again, if you know, this search is the best way to search. Click on find resources. Let's search married. So social network, nope, that's not what we want. Marital status, social person details. Okay, so they do have it under the demographics section, but understand that demographics archetypes are actually meant for an openEHR demographic server and not to be used in the clinical sense. So we will not be using this, although we technically can, but we will not be using the person details archetype. We'll instead be using another server like a FHIR server to record the actual marital status of this person. So what else do we have? Widow, again, that's the marital status. Previous menstrual history. So menstrual, let's just search menstrual. They have last menstrual period, menstrual cycle, menstrual diary, menstrual summary. So there are a lot of these things, but seems like menstruation summary will provide a good overview of all of these concepts. So again, there is LMP, which is the last menstrual period, is also here, but let's look at menstruation summary first and see all the data points that it has. So it has the overall description, the menstrual status. So again, here it's pre-menarche, post. Okay, so what is the menstrual status? Previous menstrual history, menarche at what date, age at menarche, that's exactly what it is. LMP is separate, right? So the cycle, again, by what they mean by cycle here is how their cycles are, whether it's regular, irregular, how much bleeding is there. So that is actually represented by the per episode here. And they have done a really good job at doing this, like regular or irregular, typical cycle length, how long it lasts. So I don't really think they mean all of this when they mean cycle. I think we'll just record regular and irregular. If the doctor complains, then we'll add more data points. So episode label, no. Episode start date, not really. Description, no. Typical pattern, regular or irregular, that's fine. The duration, typical menses duration, we'll keep the duration. So in days, we want there to be how many days a usual duration lasts for, typical duration. And episode date, okay, that's fine. Age at menopause, are they asking for that? Nope, they're not. So let's cancel that out. So age at menarche, menstrual status. So menstrual status, again, pre-menarche. So this also is not really captured here. So we'll cancel that. Overall description also will cancel that. So under menstruation summary, we've got all of this. Now, what we can do is they also have the LMP here. So we'll actually capture that as the LMP archetype separately. So what you can do is menstrual history, you can put both of these under one section. So if you want to, there is another archetype called ad hoc heading. So that in which you can put menstrual history, and you can actually throw both of these inside the menstrual history section. Although you can do this, but there are some issues that occur sometimes with openEHR clinical data repositories. So I don't really like putting it inside a section, but to keep things organized, you can put things inside a section. And for example, right now we have the menstruation summary and the last menstrual period both inside this particular section. Okay. Last menstrual period. We just want the date of onset. I don't think they really need the certainty description comment. Okay, we just want the date of onset. That should be okay. Now moving on, present condition. So this is what they mean by what is the current condition, what is happening currently. Now if you see here, this is a sign and symptom that we are actually capturing. Here what we actually want is the story or the history of presenting complaint, or HPI as they call it. So there is an archetype called story that you can use, story/history, that is meant exactly for this purpose. So we will include the story here. And if you look at this closely, you have story, which is textual description of everything. So for example, you can have things like patient came to the hospital with complaints of stomach pain abdominal pain for 2 months, and the pain has been progressive in nature. So you need to have some sort of way to represent this textually, and you cannot expect doctors to just input coded text all the time. So you need to have a text box that represents this. Now what you can do is look at the story and write analytics tools that will automatically pick up on the words and then populate complaints and durations, because most of the time in the story they do represent all of these things, like what exactly the complaint was and for how long it lasted and the severity of the condition and so on. So we do have a separate archetype for complaint and duration, but we do have the story/history archetype here, and that is where the present condition is. So present condition. Now if you see here, there is a slot here that they've given for structured detail of the story, and they suggest to use something like issue, health event, or even signs and symptoms. So the idea behind this is that both of these actually belong together. You usually listen to the patient's story and then you represent signs and symptoms in a more structured way using the signs and symptoms archetype. So technically in this form, although they have put this on the top as section number 1 and they have this here, you could represent this using the same archetype. So I could technically drag this and put it inside the structured detail. So technically it doesn't take that, but I could add a sign, symptom, and do the same thing that I did to complaint and duration. In fact, I think that's what I'll be doing, because it also, I want you to take home that you don't need to reflect the template exactly as how the UI should look like. You can still, in the application, you can change this. You can show the story separately, and you can then have the signs and symptoms up on top, and it will be the same. But semantically, I think it makes more sense to put the signs and symptoms as part of the present condition, because it is technically part of the present condition. It's not a separate entity. So I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to copy over. So I had the complaint and duration. I think that should be enough. So again, I'm going to rename this complaint and duration. So that will be the complaint, and body site, not really. I'm going to just cancel out everything except the duration. And duration, we'll just keep it as duration and not text. So they need to tell how many weeks or how many years that was for. And again, this also is 0 to multiple. If it's 0 to 1, okay, that won't do. So we need this to be multiple. So complaint and duration, we have put 0 to multiple here. And so now what we can do is we can actually remove this. So now the present condition has a story, and under that it has the complaint and duration. Now technically they do have the ability to add multiple stories here. So in fact, I think that would probably be better. So I believe that we can represent, for example, a complaint, like for example, fever since 2 weeks. And then we can write the story about that particular symptom. So I think that will make more sense when you're capturing data in a structured way. So I'm going to leave this as 0 to multiple, and I'm just going to change this back as 0 to 1. So they will have a story and the actual structured complaint. In fact, if you want to, you can change the order of this. Doesn't really matter. So we can change the order of it within the archetype designer, but when you're going into the UI, you have full freedom of changing this however you want. It doesn't matter. So we've captured present complaints, present condition, family history, past history, menstrual history. Now that is almost, we've done page 1. So that's it for this part. Now I have another following video where we will actually take a look at the next section. So I'll go take a break and I'll again come back and continue with this. Thank you for watching. This video was part of the openEHR course that's available on the Medblocks e-learning platform. I believe that the best way to learn a topic is to actually do it yourself and learn by doing it. So we have a lot of tasks for you in the course that we'll help you do, along with more video content just like this. And if you're interested in that, please do check it down in the link below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.